It's George from Ireland. We've got Wi-Fi on this phone. Anyway, this memorial was erected here in 2015 because it's not a stone's throw from the church where he sleeps eternally. I've been into it. You're permitted to take photos, but not to film into it. Film is only open for worship, so I shall have to go in before their orisons sometime when it's unsupervised for a moment and briefly film where the letter P is on the stone under which he lies. People used to quip that because Alexander Pope was so short, about 4'6", or about elbow high to someone like me, he was buried standing up. I don't know if that's true or not. And there's a plaque there put up by one of the American universities, I think it might have been Yale, way back in the 60s, by academics who greatly appreciate his verse, because he was a syllable stringer of some note. After Shakespeare, the most quoted person in the English language. So you can see this memorial is in the shape of an urn, and in the 18th century into the 19th century, that was a staple of funerary sculpture, an urn indicative of the ashes remaining as they've been cremated, because urna can just mean could mean a box or a tomb in Latin, as well as the urn that we have. We have only just one meaning for urn in English, really. So Alexander Pope was born in 1688 in these parts, and I just have to carry on where I left off when I was so rudely interrupted yesterday. So do forgive that hiatus. Well, not yesterday, several days ago. About Alexander Pope, born in 1688, not a propitious year for a Catholic, and indeed he was a Catholic. The year of the so-called Glorious Revolution, when James II fled because his nephew and his son-in-law William III came over from the Netherlands to investigate the supposititious infant. I shan't go into the rest. But anyway, so the Catholic monarch fled, and Protestant supremacy was underscored, and so heavy legal disabilities were placed on the Catholic minority once again, which had been temporarily relaxed under James of that name II. So Pope was born in London. His father was a very prosperous merchant, but new laws were passed which forbade Roman Catholics from residing within 10 miles of London. So they moved to Binfield in Berkshire, just beyond Windsor Forest, and that's where he grew up, in that sylvan idyll, and that informed so much of his poetry. That's why he penned so many Arcadian poems about some lovely forest, because those were the surroundings of his childhood rompings. And Catholics, strictly speaking, weren't even allowed to go to school, but a few schools existed almost openly in some parts of London, got away with it. And here we are in Twickenham, was beyond 10 miles from London, bearing in mind the London city limit was much closer to St Paul's Cathedral than it is now. Nowadays we would be not even 10 miles from Marble Arch, which by the sort of late 18th century was considered the edge of London, even though it's not the city of London per se. So Pope, he suffered some illness. I can't remember what it was that caused him to have severe curvature of the spine and be a man of exceptionally modest stature, but he was not a man of modest intellectual gifts. So his schooling consisted chiefly of the classics, Latin and ancient Greek, and that was the staple of education at the time. Of course, he was disbarred from attending university because all undergraduates were obliged to subscribe to the 39 Articles of the Church of England. That's a document drawn up under Queen Elizabeth I, saying what the Church of England is, what it believes, and particularly Article 10 was designed to be something which would be unconscionable for a Roman Catholic to swear to, that the Bishop of Rome hath no authority in this realm of England. The Bishop of Rome being better known as the Pope. So Alexander Pope, I've often speculated whether he got his surname because they were adherents of the Roman Pontiff, just possibly. So yeah, he churned out reams and reams of the very finest poetry, but not that difficult to do if you've never had to work for a living. So I don't think he ever had to earn a groat in all his born days. So Alexander Grote's Pope's prodigious talent came to the attention of the local gentry. Hello there, Diane. And so they paid for him to have extra tuition, and he got to meet King George II, that Hanoverian who was willing to put aside confessional prejudice and meet the boy despite him being a Catholic. So Alexander Pope more or less single-handedly started the Augustan age in English poetry, looking back to Augustus, the Roman emperor, which they thought was really raising the tone of the arts. and writing about the countryside and simplicity and so forth. And Twickenham really was a village in Middlesex back then, far less built up than it is today. Eel Pie Island might have been uninhabited. That's Eel Pie Island behind me. Pope, he often reworked classical themes, G'day, my lady manners, and he wrote satires. So he liked to go in for bathos as well in poetry, the art of sinking, as they call it. He wrote the Rape of the Lock. I know rape was a well-worn theme in classical literature, like, well, the rape of Lucretia, the rape of the Sabines, and so forth. Is it Leda and the Swan? But I'm not sure. Perhaps that was a consensual liaison. When a young aristocrat cut off a lock of this lady's hair, and that was rape in the broader sense, like raptare, like just grabbing, not actual vaginal violation or anything like that. But he also wrote some poetry, his essay on man, as a poem, and I could have put it from memory, so I'll get a bit wrong, saying, "Presume not God to scan, the proper study of man is man." So, although he was a Catholic, he wasn't particularly denominational. There are very few Catholics to be friends with, and indeed he's buried in an Anglican church. And he knew so many famous writers at the time. Jonathan Swift came over from Dublin, spent a lot of time with him here, and indeed he died in 1744, Pope, and Swift the following year, which is thought to mark the end of the Augustan age of English literature. So he had a very close friendship with Lady Wortley Montagu, but was it an intimate liaison, or was it simply platonic? That's a hotly debated point by scholars to this day. Well, as I said, he couldn't go to university. A little learning is a dangerous thing, as he might have said himself. Well, as he did say himself. And he had friends who were both Whigs and Tories. Horace Walpole, son of the Prime Minister, First Prime Minister Sir Robert Walpole, lived around here, so he didn't get involved in political process too much, because fools rush in where angels fear to tread. Another Popeism. Anyway, so he got into a few literary spats with other people, exchanging insults, but to err is human, to forgive divine, as Pope himself also wrote. So there would be very classically influenced, even though he wrote almost exclusively in English, with strophes and anti-strophes and choruses of youths and virgins and so on, declaiming in all his poesy. So he couldn't take part in sports as a child, which is why he devoted himself to scholarship so much. Anyway, he didn't seem to be moved by the political issues of the day. Well, slavery was uncontroversial at the time. Malnourished children were hanged for stealing food, and that didn't seem to disturb him at all. Who breaks a butterfly upon a wheel, as he once asked? But social justice was not something that bothered him in the least. So he built his house, his garden still exists, his grotto, well, his artificial cave still exists under the school, occasionally open to the public now and again, and so various things around, like Grotto Road, or named in his honour, or there's an Alexander Pope Hotel, which is not on the site of his residence. So this was a bit of an artistic community, a number of other notable writers living here, and aristocrats who were patrons of the arts living hard by, and what became Orleans House and a few others, York House, but they've often been quite extensively rebuilt. So people were travelling by the River Thames that away towards the centre of London, because going by boat was sometimes faster and safer than going by horse-drawn coach. There might be highwaymen or even footpads to rob you, but footpads wouldn't have that much chance against a horse-drawn carriage if it was going pell-mell. Anything else to point out about Alexander Pope? So he wrote in metre, obviously, rhyming as well. Hundreds of lines long, reworked, and learnt the craft of poetry, and really is flawless. So there were gardens built in his honour all over the country, and he visited George II's house at Kew, which is not very far away, about 2 miles away, and writing some lines to go on the collar of the king's dog. "I am His Majesty's dog at Kew, pray sir, whose dog are you?" So he rewrote one of St. Paul's letters as a poem as well, like "Grave, where is thy victory? Death, where is thy sting? Dying Christians to his soul." So perhaps that consoled him when he himself was called to his reward. So it's hard to think that in this fairly modest church, one of the most famous poets in the language lies interred. But he's got a plaque memorialising him at Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. So he knew so many other famous writers towards the end of his time. Anyway, that's enough about Alexander Pope. I got a phone call in the middle of this, slightly threw me. So please make sure you subscribe and follow me on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter and so forth. Toodaloo.